For the main presentation, I like to kind of set the stage. So this is a piece of music, which is called, when it was written in 1900, the Negro National Anthem. And it has since then become known as the Black National Anthem. It was written originally to celebrate Abraham Lincoln's birthday, and became more widely spread out, known as national anthem. Sort of, it should be sung, but I don't think I could sing it. But I don't think you'd want me to sing it, so I'll try to just read it. It's lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmony of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the many skies. Let it resound as the rolling seas. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march until victory is won. Stony the road we try, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady best have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers died. We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. God of our wearied years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us this far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path, we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, when we meet thee, lest our hearts drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land. Thank you.
Good afternoon and happy Juneteenth to everyone. How are you?
Bye.
Doing great? Awesome. I love it when people are doing great. So my name is Michele Hewitt, and I'm going to talk to you today about the celebration that is happening today, which is Juneteenth. I am a licensed clinical mental health counselor or therapist in Catawba County. I work with lots of different populations in my therapy work. I am also a professor at Lenoir-Rhyne University, an adjunct professor at Lenoir-Rhyne University. I teach in the graduate program for clinical mental health studies. So just last night, I was teaching a class about diversity in the helping professions. I also teach about couples and family and how to do therapy with couples and family, as well as I supervise students who are getting ready to go into their internship as they become new counselors in the field. And so I've done a presentation with Erin before back in February, and she asked me to come and talk to you all about today's presentation, today's celebration, which is the celebration of Juneteenth. How many of you, by a show of hands, how many of you have heard of Juneteenth before? Oh, yay, awesome. Because a lot of people have maybe heard of it, but they don't understand what it is. They don't know why we celebrate Juneteenth. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about why we celebrate Juneteenth and why it's important and why it's significant. So we're going to talk today about the what, the when, and the why. We're going to talk a little bit about what is Juneteenth and why it's significant. we're going to talk about the significance of when Juneteenth happened, because what we know is in our country, even today, there is an sort of onslaught about our history. We want to study the history that makes us all feel really good, but we don't want to really study the history that makes us not feel so good. And Juneteenth, in some ways, is a part of that we often hear people talking about, well, we don't need to talk about that anymore because it happened and it's over and it's not important. We just need to learn how to move forward. But oftentimes, we are not able to adequately and successfully move forward as we forge forward in history because we tend to negate our past. So we're going to talk about the significance of when Juneteenth happened and all of the things that go with that. And then we're also going to talk about why Juneteenth is relevant today. Okay? So what is Juneteenth? Juneteenth is a celebration of liberation and freedom. And when you hear the words liberation and freedom, most often people think about what day? When you think about liberation, freedom, independence, what is the day that most people think about?
July 4th.
July 4th. What was July 4th a liberation or an independence day of? Freedom from who?
Great Britain.
From Great Britain, right? So July 4th, we don't take anything away from that. Yay, we love July 4th. But June
Who had their freedom on July 4th?
Who had their freedom on July 4th?
Yeah.
Excellent question. The people who had their freedom on July 4th were the original settlers, the original colonies. They were celebrating their freedom after the American Revolution from Great Britain. So their freedom, the freedom that is celebrated July 4th, is the freedom of no longer being a part of Great Britain, but becoming its own country, the United States becoming its own country.
But under the Constitution, it was only for the white males.
Woo, you just jumping all into my stuff, aren't you?
I mean, when you talk about freedom, you've got to define freedom for whom, and then you can talk about Juneteenth.
Absolutely, and we're going to talk about that. Freedom for whom, okay? So when we talk about Juneteenth, we're talking about, it's a play on the date, June 19th, 1865. And that date is significant because that is the date that General Gordon Granger announced to the people of Galveston, Texas, that all of the enslaved people were free. And so again, you go, well, wait a minute. Still doesn't make sense. And we're talking about 1865. So I want to go back just a little bit. And I want to give you a little bit of history. So on January 1st of 1863, President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, if you know your history, what was going on around 1861-ish? What started in 1861? Anybody? The Civil War. The Civil War started in 1861. So about 20 months into the Civil War, President Lincoln had this document, the Emancipation Proclamation, and he signed it saying initially that all persons who were held as slaves are and henceforth shall be free. So there was this document that he freed the slaves. Now, the Civil War did not end until almost 2 years later, in 1865. So there was this document and this proclamation by President Lincoln that all slaves were free, but the war went on an additional 18 months to 2 years. So you go, well, Michele, why is that significant? That's significant because that piece of paper freed a really small number of people. And I'm going to show you why. We're going to come back to this, but I want to jump ahead to this map, okay? What you see on the map is the states that are in blue up here. Those states that are in blue were part of the Union, and they were Union-free states, okay?
But they still had slaves.
We're going to get to that. So there are the states here that you see in these sort of lighter blue, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Delaware. Those are called border states. They are in light blue because they were a part of the Union, but they also had slaves. Okay. Then we have the states that are in the sort of lighter gray: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Those are slave states from the South that succeeded from the Union after Fort Sumter, which happened about 1861. Then there are these other states, these darker ones: Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. These are the states that succeeded from the Union before Fort Sumter. And you go, well, why is that important? That's important because, and these in the yellow, these are all just like territories. It's important because these border states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Delaware, these border states were states that were a part of the Union, but had slaves. So they were for slavery, but they also had an allegiance to the federal government or to the Union. So when you think about it, we had people on the one end that were all about slavery and wanted to keep slavery and were fighting to keep slavery, the Southern states. You had the Union, the Southern states of the Confederacy. You had the Northern states who wanted to abolish slavery, and you had the border states that were kind of like straddling the fence. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? They had slavery, but they supported the federal government. Okay, so that's important. So that information becomes important. So let's go back. Yes, sir.
You're being too kind to the northern states. New York, Pennsylvania had slaves.
Absolutely.
There were slaves throughout the North. Up
Absolutely.
in Massachusetts, there were slaves. But the majority of the state was Union. And so I think so I have to paint a picture of slavery gradually growing from the northern states through the border states where you had, as you say, this conflict between Union and Southern, and then into the southern states. So slavery, I mean, even in California, it was slavery.
But by all means, please, no mistaking, that there was slavery throughout the North, right? There was slavery even to the West, even into the California territories.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What we're talking about, though, is during this time of division of what was then the United States, one of the arguable points was we want to abolish slavery, and the Southern states did not. That does not mean, hear me clearly, does not mean that there was not slave owners in the North. The first 10 of our 12 presidents were all slave owners. Okay? So there is no, please don't misunderstand, there is no cut and dry. There was no like line that was drawn and it was like, there are no slaves here and then all of the slaves are here. It was all melded together. But the ideology of the time was the Union, their talking point was, we want to abolish slavery, and the Southern states did not. Okay? So we have the Emancipation Proclamation that was signed. When the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, there were only a small number of slaves that were freed. Again, we look at the date, 1863. Essentially, the Civil War did not end until April 9th of 1865, some 18 to 20 months after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and Robert E. Lee surrendering at Appomattox Courthouse was essentially the end of the Civil War. Okay? So then but there is another surrender that's important to our history that nobody really talks about. How many of you have ever heard the name General Edmund Kirby Smith? Has anybody ever heard that name before?
Yeah.
Okay. There was a surrender in Galveston, Texas of General Smith. He surrendered to Union forces on June 2nd, 1865. Now, again, I want to go back to the map. When we talk about the Confederacy, we see that Texas was a part of the Confederacy, but Texas was kind of an outlier. It was a little bit further out. And there were some historical things that were happening with Texas along with Mexico. So when we talk about the the surrender, part of the reason why this date, June 2nd, is so important is because up until this time, one of the myths of Juneteenth is that the people in Texas just didn't know that the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed. That is a falsehood. The people of Texas, the slave owners in Texas, knew all about the Emancipation Proclamation. They knew about the ending of the Civil War, but they were insulated in such a way that there weren't a whole lot of battles that were happening in Texas. There wasn't a whole lot of activity or movement happening in Texas. So they were very insulated. And because they were insulated, they were able to there were no forces really that came into play to say, Civil War is over, we're abolishing slavery, and the slaves are free. So it wasn't until June 19th of 1865 that General Gordon Granger, along with about 2,000 Union soldiers, came in and made the announcement of freedom for the slaves official. Okay, I want to read to you the actual order. I'll show you. So this is General Gordon Granger. It's called General Orders number 3. And I want to read to you what that general order said. It is said that General Gordon Granger stood on the balcony of what used to be the headquarters of the Confederacy in Texas and read this statement with slaves standing underneath and all. It was a very public declaration. And General Orders number 3 reads, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages." So the problem with General Orders number 3 is it announced to the people of Galveston, Texas, that the people who were enslaved were now free. But it also encouraged them to go back to their owners, to their slave masters, and to work for them. Okay? So there was this sort of loophole between the language of the Emancipation Proclamation as well as the general order. Now, Juneteenth comes around. This happens on June 19th of 1865. And as you can imagine, the slaves that were there were a lot of mixed emotions. There were a lot of mixed reactions. Some people were jubilant and they were excited. Yeah. Right. Okay, but there were others who were confused and who didn't trust the general and didn't trust what was being said. So there was this lot of conflict. Now, I want to make a note from a historical perspective. It is not because of the Emancipation Proclamation it is not only because of the General Order number 3 that there were free slaves. Throughout the Civil War, enslaved people, they escaped, they ran away to freed lands to the north, to the border states. So there is this misnomer that all of the slaves were freed the day that the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. And that's kind of the history that a lot of us was taught in school. It wasn't until I was more closely an adult and doing research on my own that I had ever heard of General Granger. Even further into my adulthood, doing my own studies, that I had even heard of General Kirby Smith. Okay? The idea was that President Lincoln freed the slaves and slaves were just all roundabout and they were doing their thing, okay? And that's not necessarily true. So we have this general order that's being read on June 19th of 1865. Slaves are leaving. Now, when they leave, some slaves leave this area in Galveston, Texas, and they start to travel northeast to the border states, and even to the north. A lot of them wanted to find family that they had been separated from. A lot of them just simply wanted to get out of Galveston. And then there was a large number of people who stayed in Galveston and did exactly what the general order kind of instructed, was to go back and to work with the slave owners. Okay. So we go on to a year later, the first Juneteenth celebration happens. It is often referred to as Jubilee Day. It is sometimes referred to as Freedom Day or Emancipation Day. It happened right along. It happened on the right under Ashton Villa balcony, which is the balcony that is said that General Granger made the initial announcement of freedom a year before. This picture you see is of the first Juneteenth celebration on June 19th, 1866. I want to go back to here to the timeline for just a moment. This first Juneteenth celebration was centralized around the African American church. The church was the central place where everyone sort of gathered. And Juneteenth was a huge celebration. It was about liberation. It was about freedom. It was about family. Okay. So it was, and the church was the center of the celebration. Now, during this time, from 1865 to even through 1860 and on into the 1870s and 80s, the slaves that left Galveston, and even those that stayed in the Texas area, they began to create their own communities, and they were called freedom communities. And these communities grew and were abundant and were successful. They started sort of insulating or isolating themselves, and they were growing their own community. Okay, and these communities were strong. These were strong communities. These were financially stable communities. Because remember, who was tilling the land? Who was providing the crops? So these now freed slaves or Americans, African Americans, had the knowledge and the wherewithal to maintain communities of their own. And they were called freedom communities. Okay. So from about the 1860s, late 1860s on into the 70s and 80s, we see these communities thriving. We see them thriving. Now, we go back and we go, okay, wait a minute. So the Emancipation Proclamation didn't necessarily free the slaves. Then the General Orders number 3 was read. It didn't necessarily free the slaves. There were probably about 250,000 slaves in Galveston, Texas, and around that area that were freed. Okay, but the masses of slaves were not freed at this point. I want you to notice the date. December 6, 1865 is when the 13th Amendment was ratified, and it was not proclaimed until December 18th, 1865. And the 13th Amendment read, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." So what this says is, again, there was this sort of loophole that had to be sort of rectified. And it wasn't really rectified. So in December of 1865, the 13th Amendment. Now, we go back to the General Orders. We go back to the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation and the General Orders were all about the Union states. Because at the time that they came about, the Union still did not have any control or any real authority over the Confederacy. So even though the proclamation had been made, even though the law had been put into place that slaves were to be freed, it really applied to the northern states because at that time, Civil War is still going on, the North really had no real authority with the Confederate States. So when the 13th Amendment comes along, the 13th Amendment comes along for two reasons. You remember we talked about those border states that were kind of straddling? They were like, yeah, we've got slaves, but and we like the federal government as it is, right? The 13th Amendment really came about to address slavery in the border states as we moved into the southern states. The 13th Amendment was really a way to sort of force the border states to pick a side. Okay? So that's why that's important. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about what happens next. We go into what is called the Jim Crow era. And we wonder, well, why is that important at this point? So if we look back at the 13th Amendment, there is a statement here that's very interesting. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, wherefore the party shall have been duly convicted, that's the only way that slavery can exist in the United States, according to the 13th Amendment, December 1865. Okay, so we move forward past 1865. We have these communities, these freedom communities coming onto the scene. African Americans are finding themselves financially stable. They're building houses, they have land, they have their own communities, and they're thriving. People across the United States still were not happy about this because slavery was about economics. And now economics were being impacted by this whole idea that slaves were now free. Okay? So there's this idea about how do we sort of stand in the way of this without really saying we're standing in the way of this? And one of the ways was this clause that says slavery or involuntary servitude can only exist as punishment. So how do we create a manner of punishment? Well, what we do is we create Jim Crow. Okay? Jim Crow began about 1877 and ran all the way through the mid-1960s. The Jim Crow was a racial caste system that was primarily in the South and the border states. It was not simply just about rigid laws, but it also became a way of life. So if anyone knows anything about Jim Crow, this is where we start talking about the separation of education. We start talking about white and colored entrances into restaurants, into public buildings, okay? It became a way of relegating African Americans as second-class citizens. From 1877 to the mid-1960s, okay? And so if as an African American, you went into an establishment and you came in through the whites only door versus the colored door, you had committed a crime. And what happens if you are convicted of a crime? You can go back into slavery, right? So this was a manner of control, of power and control. That became a way of life. Even throughout the Jim Crow era, though, we see an emergence of African American communities that are thriving and that are continuing to thrive and that are popping up in different areas. What else is happening during this time period? Well, there's World War I. So we have World War I starting in about 1914. And during this time period, we see now, as we talk about Juneteenth, up until this time, there are huge community-wide Juneteenth celebrations that are happening across the country, not just in Galveston, Texas, but in other areas as well. There are these huge community events and celebrations of liberation and freedom. We get to about World War I, about 1914, and we begin to see a decrease in the number of community-wide Juneteenth celebrations. Part of the reason that we see that is because of World War I. America was trying to set itself up as a world leader and a global leader. And so wanted everything to just sort of be, oh, you know, unicorns and rainbows, right? And so during World War I, we see a drop off in Juneteenth celebrations because to celebrate Juneteenth and the end of slavery was to be unpatriotic. It was seen as divisive. And so, although in the homes of many African Americans, Juneteenth continued to be something that was celebrated, those big community-wide celebrations that we saw people in the streets and having big parades and things like that, those started to diminish. Again, also under the guise of the laws of Jim Crow. Okay? The other thing that happened is Red Summer. How many of you know what Red Summer is? Does anybody know what Red Summer is?
Yeah.
Tell me what Red Summer is.
It was a time when there was a lot of violence going on between whites and blacks. It was a time when black veterans came out of World War I. They had been in France and they had gotten a taste of real freedom. And they came back to Jim Crow South. And the conflict just grew because Black people wanted more freedom. They had tasted freedom. They were veterans. They had fought for this country. And they wanted recognition, and the whites refused that. And so you had tremendous conflicts, which ended up in 1921 in the Tulsa, Oklahoma riots, the destruction of the Greenwood, the burning and the bombing of a whole Black community. So Black communities were being destroyed by essentially the KKK was being reinvented as a way of enforcing Jim Crow laws. And lynching was one of the ways in which Jim Crow was enforced. And so you had a tremendous, I guess you would say, a reversal of the relationships. And the whites, many whites felt very threatened by blacks because they wanted more freedom. They wanted real freedom is still just freedom in words. The Emancipation Proclamation was words. It was never fulfilled. And so they had to do this, and the whites were revolting against it. It was a terribly I'm trying to think of backward steps, because the KKK, for example, took over the government in Indiana. The governor of Indiana was a member of the KKK in the 1920s and the 1930s. And there was a march in Washington by the KKK. There were 50,000 people marching with white hoods through the streets of Washington, D.C. It was a really, I think, a very violent, very terrible time.
Absolutely.
And we never talk about it.
We never talk about it.
I'm
As
glad
I
you're right.
asked the question, who knows what Red Summer is? And there were no hands really that they came up. Red Summer was all about exactly what he's talking about. It was a time where we saw a tremendous increase in violence against African Americans, particularly lynchings. And so the Red Summer was about the amount of bloodshed that was spewed and spilled during this particular time because of exactly what he's talking about. Exactly because there were veterans that had come, African American veterans that had come back, that had gotten a taste of what real freedom was like. There were African American communities that were under assault because they were thriving. So there were a lot of things. So we talk about the Jim Crow era as this block of time that, as we talk about Juneteenth, The Emancipation Proclamation was the release of slaves on paper. Juneteenth was the actual physical release of slaves. Okay, so again, why is Juneteenth important? Because it is the actual doing of something, not just the words. Okay, so we talk about the Jim Crow era, and this era of immense violence that African Americans experience throughout our country. We talk about, like I said, I teach at Lenore Ryan. And last night, I had class last night, and we were talking about race and racism last night. And one of my students said, well, we were talking about systemic racism and how systems in our country were built. And we were talking about how during the Jim Crow era, one of the reasons Jim Crow was able to succeed was Jim Crow took victimhood away from African Americans who had been former slaves and made white slave owners and white people the victim. Does that make sense? Let me explain. The victims of Jim Crow were the African Americans, former enslaved people. They were the ones that were being lynched. They were the ones whose homes were being burned down. They were the ones whose homes and businesses were being destroyed. And the ideology of the time switched from the African Americans, former slaves, from being the victims to the white landowners and the white members of government, the politicians saying, oh my gosh, they are going to take our land and they are going to destroy us and they are going to treat us badly. And so they twisted the narrative to make it seem as though they had become the victims.
Wasn't this kind of an expansion of the lost cause?
Mm-hmm.
The understanding that the South lost not because they were not good enough or strong enough, but because the North was just destroying them. And the South was still a viable place, or should be.
Should have been. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. So we have this era that runs up to the 1960s. Again, in the 1960s, we start seeing the civil rights movement. We start seeing these uprisings in contrast to and against these Jim Crow laws. So we have all of these things. So this is a time period of a lot of growth in our country in a lot of different ways. Okay. Also during this time, again, we're seeing a decline in people celebrating Juneteenth, celebrating liberation and freedom, because the overarching idea is that it is unpatriotic and that we should not worry about. We shouldn't think about like slavery and all that stuff. We should come together and unify. But the unification was based upon people still doing and being exactly what the dominant culture wanted them to do and be. Okay, so we go up into the mid 60s. So the picture on the screen is that of Representative Al Edwards. There's lots of changes in the 1960s and the 1970s. Again, we see a decline in Juneteenth. Most people, again, don't even know that Juneteenth is something that exists.
Yeah.
It's all about July 4th and Independence Day and all of that. Representative Al Edwards was a Democrat from Houston, Texas, and he introduced House Bill 1016, which was a bill to make Juneteenth a state holiday. He worked with a coalition of African Americans, of Latino population, and the bill was passed. And so Juneteenth becomes the first official state emancipation holiday across the country due to the efforts of Representative Edwards, and it was signed into law on June 7th, 1979. After he kind of won this battle, He then said, we need a memorial for Juneteenth. And he began to campaign for a memorial that would be placed in Galveston, Texas, that would memorialize the Juneteenth celebrations and all of that. And the memorial that he proposed was to be of 5 statues. And guess what? He hit a snag. And guess what the snag was? People started pulling funding. He had a hard time raising money for this statue, for this memorial that was going to memorialize Juneteenth. To the point of they only were able to actually construct one of the statues, and that particular statue bore an amazing resemblance to Representative Edwards. And that statue still stands today. But because funding had been pulled, the other statues were not completed. Okay, so then there's this reemergence of of Juneteenth. Back in 2020, what happened in 2020? What was the big? COVID happened in 2020, right? But along with COVID, we saw the murder of George Floyd play out.
Yeah.
For all of us to see. We saw the murder of Breonna Taylor.
Yeah.
And we saw the rise, and others, I named those because those are names that people know immediately. But there were others that were murdered. We saw the reemergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it was with these things, the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, the murder of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, and others, that people began to have this renewed call for racial justice and equality. And so this is where we start seeing this emergence of Juneteenth again. We start hearing about Juneteenth because the spirit of Juneteenth is about liberation. It's about freedom. It's about equality. It's about justice. Okay? So we see this reemergence happening here. And on July 17th of 2021, based on the work of Representative Barbara Lee of California, President Joe Biden signed into law the Juneteenth National Independence Day, which is today. Today, this is the first federal holiday. Juneteenth is now considered a federal holiday with all the benefits of a federal holiday.
Right.
And that is because of the work of Representative Lee, whose work was also based upon the work of Representative Edwards, the call for equality and justice for all people from Black Lives Matter and from other advocacy groups, and just simply for the need to ring the alarm. We go back all the way back to the Constitution that says all men are created equal. All men are created equal in the Constitution meant the group of white men that were sitting in that room composing the Constitution. But when we read the Constitution, if we are going to base our country and who we are on the Constitution, all men, white men, Black men, Hispanic men, Indian men, oh, wait a minute, women, oh, wait a minute, children, all humankind. That is the essence of Juneteenth. That is the essence. So people say, well, I've never even heard of Juneteenth before. Why should we celebrate? This is why we should celebrate. Because Juneteenth, and it's not an African-American holiday. It's an American holiday. It is a part of American history that we all have to embrace in order for us as a country, us as a people, to be the best that we can be as we move forward. Okay? So when I talk about Juneteenth and when I talk to you about what Juneteenth is and what it means, I admonish you that as we today celebrate Juneteenth, What we are celebrating is the demise of slavery, the continued pursuit of freedom and justice for all people, and the embracing of the opportunity to remember the past and honor the past so that we can create a better future. Now, that's kind of an odd thing to say. It's good. We want to honor the past, even though there's some bad stuff in the past. You know what? We have to honor the bad stuff because the bad stuff happened. Slavery happened.
Yeah.
Jim Crow happened. People died and lost their lives. But out of their death rose awakening, rose fight, rose integrity, rose radical change. All good things. So we have to honor, we have to pay attention to the things that kind of make us itch a little bit, like, oh, I don't want to talk about that because that makes me feel a little bad. No, we got to talk about that. Because if something is itching, you don't feel better until you scratch it. And so much of what we are experiencing even today in 2024 is there's an itch, but we don't want to scratch it because scratching it will make it better. Scratching it will disrupt the power struggle that's in place. But in order for us to be the best of who we can be, we have to scratch that itch. So why do we celebrate Juneteenth? We celebrate Juneteenth because we are all looking for, excited about liberty and justice for who? For me? For Aaron? For people walking down the hallway? For people like out in the parking lot? Just for them? Just for them? For everybody. For everybody. Right? That is what we celebrate on today. That is what we celebrate on today. Yes, ma'am.
Why did you come down here?
Because they wanted you to hear me run my mouth.
Stop and singing.
You want to sing? You want
Not me.
to sing? You want to hear me sing? No, ma'am, you don't want to hear me sing. No, ma'am, you don't want to hear. Now, you might hear somebody sing.
Yeah.
There might be somebody in here singing, but it won't be me. No, ma'am. Because, if I start singing, you know what? You're going to ask these people, what in the world was that? Like, what is that? What are those cats out there screaming about? Oh, my God. So we got to find somebody to sing for this young lady. Somebody got to sing for the young lady.
Wow.
You ready?
You gonna sing? She said she was brought down here to hear somebody sing. I'm not.
I don't think I could either.
We'll see if we can find you somebody
I'd
to
like to be
sing.
able to. It's a good tune.
We'll see. I'll see if I can find you somebody to sing. Okay. Okay.
We got the words right here.
Any other questions or comments from anyone?
Yes.
Yes.
Could you say something about Reconstruction?
Oh gosh, how much time do we have?
It seems to me that was one of the forces which resulted in Jim Crow laws.
As a result of Jim Crow?
As a result of the success of Reconstruction, Black people were able to show that they were economically strong, they were politically strong, and they knew what they were doing, and they were successful. There were state senators, state governors that were Black, and the white population looked at this and said, "Oh my gosh, they're a threat to us." And so you end up with the result of Jim Crow and lynchings and the attempt to control Black population, return them to the attitude of slavery and so on. And it seemed to me Reconstruction was a big impetus to re-enslave the Black people.
Absolutely. Reconstruction was this amazing time period. During Reconstruction, absolutely, as you were saying, there was this emergence of, or this surge of African Americans being successful. They were going into
Yeah.
politics. I mean, even if we go all the way back to, even if we go all the way back to the 1860s and 70s, when the freedom communities began to pop up on the scene,
Yeah.
what happened was the African Americans began to talk about political rights, because what comes with freedom was the right to vote,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Supposedly, right?
Yeah.
Was the right to vote. So we saw, even back in the 1860s and 1870s, we saw this emergence of African Americans talking about politics and getting into politics. We saw this emergence. And at every point that we see this sort of emergence, we see the forces in power trying to then
Right.
shut it down.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what Reconstruction was all about. There were these African American communities that were forging forward, that were being built. They were economically and politically and financially secure.
Yeah.
And we talk about that sort of reverse victimhood. People in power, white people in power, were going, they're going to take over and they're going to do us dirty. And so that change in ideology and in thought was a part of why we see Reconstruction. And then they started attacking Reconstruction. And we see again where African American communities are being destroyed as another way of trying to pull them under the thumb of Big Brother.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
Right. But, also during that time, we saw the Harlem Renaissance, and we saw the emergence of Black music and Black art and Black education. We saw some of our country's greatest thinkers came out of the African American community. Some of our greatest inventors and scholars came out of African American communities that were also being held under the guise of Jim Crow laws. And yet they still rose.
Aren't we kind of seeing a re-emergence of that whole attitude? Take Florida.
Let's take Florida.
Yeah.
Can we take Florida?
Let's get rid of it. But isn't that what's kind of happening now? Is we're kind of seeing this.
We are absolutely, because what's happening is there is the political climate.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is Michelle. Okay, this is Michelle. We are living in a time and in a political climate that is being fueled by fear. And the fear that is the fuel of that fear is that if I am no longer in power, if people who are currently in power, if we find equity or allow for equity, then we lose something. And the fear of that loss is sort of adding fuel to the fire. And how do we keep minorities, not just Black people, but all minorities, any group that may be said to be on the margins of society, how do we keep them in line? And so we see that happening through the removal of women's rights. We see that through the removal of, rhetoric that is harmful and that is hurtful, that is not helpful. We see that through the use of religion. We see that through the use of education, banning books, things of that nature. So yes, we are seeing that, to answer your question, we are seeing the same, history ebbs and flows, right? There is nothing new that is happening.
Yeah.
There is nothing new that is happening. It's just showing up differently. But if you take the prettiness off of it, at the end of the day, the tools and devices that are being used in 2024 were the same exact tools that were being used in the 1860s and the 1800s.
And like you say, it's all based on fear.
Absolutely. That is
Fear of what's going to happen.
Yes.
The fear of the unknown.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the fear that we cannot live all together in equality and in peace. Yes, sir.
I was raised in a small town, east of here, Rockville. And we had, and I don't know what this was about, because I was too old to really be into this. we had the black population on either end of town, and the whites right in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
And then somebody who knows, I don't know if anybody here is correct for it or not, but they had a black school, a whole separate school that was just for blacks.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a public school too.
Mm-hmm. And that was a means of keeping everyone separated. That was a means of control and power,
Yeah.
even in your hometown. I by no means want you to leave here today thinking that I have given you all of the information, all from A to Z about Juneteenth and about our history. What I do want you to leave here with is a renewed sense of what can I do? Even if it's, can I read a book and learn more about the history that I never knew about? Is there something about our history that I don't know, that I haven't been exposed to, that I can learn about? If one person in this room leaves here and does that, or at least asks that question of themselves, then I've done my job. Okay? I appreciate you. I appreciate your attentiveness. I appreciate your input and your questions. I applaud you, Trinity Lutheran Homes and Trinity Oaks, for doing this and being open and available to do this for your residents and for your staff. And thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Nathan. Oh, we gotta thank you online too.
Oh, and thank you to those of you who are online. I love you very much. I appreciate you.